right. Well, hello, friends. We have got a really great interview today. If you are doing any form of marketing, which I assume that you are, you already know that copy really is the foundation of all marketing. Whether you're making videos, whether you're doing audio, whether you're writing social media posts or actual sales pages and so on, the importance of being able to present your material in a way that's highly persuasive and that gets results. And so writing and copy are really the foundation of all of that. And for a really long time, I've been fascinated with the world of direct response copy. I've loved the idea that you can sort of write money from the tip of a pen. And I've studied all these guys, the Claude Hopkins, Robert Colliers, Eugene Schwartz, Joe Sugarman, Dan Kennedy, Gary Bencivenga, people like that. And so I love this world, and our guest today really comes out of that world. He's from that tree, so to speak. And I've also long been fascinated by story, movies. I was a film guy. I went to film school. And I've always been interested in the way that stories can sort of tap into archetypal emotions, sort of those universal rites of passage that we all go through as human beings, and how to really use those to persuade and make a difference and make an impact on others. And our guest today combines both of those streams, the direct response copy stream and the story stream. He is a world-class individual in these two areas. So I want to introduce to you, David Garfinkel. Let me just read you David's bio. David is an award-winning journalist. He's a world-class copywriter whose copy has generated tens of millions of dollars in sales across 100 plus different industries. He's a top professional copywriting coach, and he's the host of the Copywriters podcast. He's been featured in the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, the Huffington Post, the Los Angeles Times, Fast Company, Entrepreneur Magazine, and dozens of other publications. David is the best-selling author of Breakthrough Copywriting, and he's the co-author with J. Conrad Levinson of Guerrilla Copywriting. And David's innovative book, Advertising Headlines That Make You Rich, is the first on a list of only 6 books recommended by content marketing guru Michael Hyatt in his New York Times bestseller platform. And I could go on and on. David's credentials, we could go on all day about those, but he really is world class at what he does. So what I love about David, he really is the real deal. If you tried to hire him, chances are you probably couldn't afford to hire him. Only the hardest of the hardcore successful marketers really could. He's in that class. He's a student of the game. He's an old school direct response copy guy who not only knows how to write copy, but also how to teach it and how to coach it. And he's also somebody, as I said at the top, who is fascinated by the power of story. And so I really think that you're going to get a lot out of this interview. This is going to be highly actionable for you. You're going to be able to learn principles of story and copy, frameworks that you can immediately implement in your own business. And I think that if you have heard about story before and you've heard about Joseph Campbell and Hero's Journey and all of that, this is going to be much different than you think. So we're not talking about the same old stuff about story that you've ever heard before. So with that, I want to introduce our very special guest today, David Garfinkel. Welcome, David.
Thanks, Rocky. Nice to be here.
Yeah, sure. Well, before we get into and this is going to be like a master class for people. I think that's how we both talked about this and wanted to present this to people, really, really usable material. But before we get there, let's talk about your story, because you really have an interesting story. You actually grew up not far from where I'm at right now in Maryland. You're one state up from me. And then you were in journalism and all of that. So I would love to hear kind of how you got into writing. Like, was it something that you did from an early age? And then kind of how you moved toward copywriting.
Yeah, sure. Writing came naturally to me. Now, as I became a professional, I learned good writing comes naturally to nobody. It's a lot of work, a lot of rewrite, but it was always easy for me to write. I published a short story in the high school literary magazine when I was 14. I got on the student newspaper when I was 16. I became editor when I was 17. Here's a little bit of trivia. I met in the courtyard of Richard Montgomery High School in Rockville when I was 17 with a guy named Bob, who was a reporter for the local Montgomery Sentinel, Montgomery County Sentinel. He subsequently did an investigative series that got all of the principals fired. or downgraded in from the high schools in Montgomery County. Then he went on to work for the Washington Post. You've probably heard of
I'm kind of wondering who Bob might
Bob Woodward. Yeah.
be. Yeah.
But I mean, that was a 10-minute meeting. That's my claim to fame with Bob Woodward. Yeah. And then when I was in college, I worked on the student newspaper, and I got a job right out of college. Strangely enough, I didn't know anything about business. My parents were government workers, scientists, but I got a job with Fairchild News Service, and Fairchild published, I don't think they even exist as Fairchild anymore. They published a lot of trade newspapers, and the one you might have heard in the business is Women's Wear Daily. That was sort of their flagship, and that's more than a trade newspaper. It's sort of a cultural publication too. But anyway, somehow I got attracted to the world of business, and I liked it. I didn't know anything about it, and ended up working in New York. It got too cold for me in the winter, so I took a vacation to Key West and saw an old college roommate working on the Key West Citizen daily newspaper, and managed to talk myself into a job there. And I mean, the end of this story is I found out I'm not really much of an employee, because I didn't last there very long, and then went back to DC, worked on the home building magazine, went to New York for McGraw-Hill on their home building magazine, moved to Chicago to be a news correspondent for the McGraw-Hill World News Service, and then the coup de grace, coup de grace, excuse me. Coup de grace means a big piece of fat. Coup de grace is I came to San Francisco to be a San Francisco bureau chief, but unfortunately, the same job, different address. I realized this wasn't for me. Along the way, when I'd been in New York, when I'd been in Chicago, when I was out here in San Francisco, I'd been taking these classes in playwriting and improv comedy, and out in California, of course, screenwriting. Yep. And that it always fascinated me. To be honest, I didn't use it very much in the business journalism I was doing. It took me a while. It took a while for it all to sink in and figure out. And I think it was really copywriting that brought it all together, because we use stories in copy, I'd say much more effectively than most journalists. I mean, the best journalists, the John McPhees of the world, the what's his name? Michael Lewis, a great storyteller. Sure. He wrote the book that ended up becoming the movie Moneyball, right?
And The Big Short too.
And The Big Short, yeah. But it's not that copywriters are the best storytellers. I think novelists and screenwriters are the best storytellers. But story is an essential stock in trade. So anyway, I left McGraw-Hill. I left my my prize job, which wasn't such a prize to me, in 1985, and went through 6 years in the wilderness, really, not knowing what I could do, not having a way to make money. I mean, when I was at McGraw-Hill, I'd call somebody. I had this David Garfinkel from McGraw-Hill, and they'd pick up the phone.
Right.
And then I say, David Garfinkel, oh, I'm sorry, he's in a meeting right now. Can he get back to you? And he never get back to me. I discovered copywriting in, I'd say, 91, 92, 93. I read something Jay Abraham published called Your Marketing Genius at Work, and I went through the whole thing and thought, this is interesting. And then when I came across a copy of Gary Halbert's letter, I was just like mesmerized. I read it over and over and over again. I thought, I don't know what he's doing, but I want to know, and I want to do this myself.
Yeah.
And from there, I got into copywriting, and that was almost 30 years ago, I guess.
I mean, did you find over the course of your career in journalism that, because I remember reading this with something Joe Sugarman wrote, that the people that are sort of naturally fascinated by little facts, or they love to learn, and it's just like but they're also bored. They tend to be like they get bored relatively quickly, but so having the ability to focus on one story for a short period of time, where you can go really deep and learn everything about it, and then move on to something else because you get bored with it. That's sort of like a natural trait for a copywriter, because they're just endlessly like interested in stuff and curious, but yet they're bored. Is that something maybe in journalism that you sort of had as a maybe a personality trait or something like that? Like if you were to look
Yeah.
inward at yourself and go like, what was it that kind of led you in this direction?
Yeah, absolutely. It was. I'm not sure that was the reason I became a journalist, but that's a personality trait to this day. Yes, very much
Yeah.
so.
Yeah. So when you started moving into copy, so what was that sort of, were you self-taught, or did you like stumble into a job somewhere? Like what was that first entry point for you into the world of, direct response copy?
Well, I was self-taught in a sense. I mean, I've had mentors and help along the way, but I didn't have a mentor like over the course of several years. I remember very early on, my girlfriend at the time, who lived in Phoenix, knew somebody who had something that couldn't even exist today. But her friend was owner of a business travel management company, and this was, of course, way before the internet and Expedia and all the different online travel services. So they would set up ticket printers inside their client companies, which was a big deal 30 years ago. It seems a little archaic now, of course. And they had a problem, a marketing problem. Their problem was, once they had a client, the client would refer them like crazy, and they get all kinds of business. But they had this like 3-pound glossy brochure. It could have hung in the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Unfortunately, they knew the response they would get every time they mailed it, and it was always zero, nothing. And so they could only get business by referral. They didn't know how to get business any other way. I had a mentor for that. I can't remember how I got in touch with him. His name was Glenn Osborne. He was one of Jay Abraham's proteges, and he walked me through this letter. And I wrote I think it's like a 2.5-page letter, no graphics. You print it out on a laser printer, and then you print the envelope out in a laser printer. It's very plain Jane stuff, apile stuff, as Gary would have called it. And Glenn, I would send it to Glenn. He sent it back to me like 6 times. And this was very painful for me. I wasn't used to rewriting. I've been a rip and read kind of, newsman. It was a great lesson. And this letter ended up bringing $40 million worth of business for the company. They had to stop mailing it. They mailed it out in small batches because I'd been able to capture a story that would get a qualified prospect interested to have a meeting with them. And once someone had a meeting with them, it was all over. They buy, it was a good deal. It was, so that was a lead generation letter I did. I studied everything I could. I went to every seminar I could. I would devour Gary Halbert letters. He used to publish a subscription newsletter for a couple $100 a year. I went to this one seminar which Gary held. Ted Nicholas was there. David Deutsch was there. John Carlton was there. Carl Galletti was there. I'm sure Bond and Kevin were there, but I don't remember. They were probably very young at the time. This was in like 93. And, I bought materials from all these people. I studied them. I worked, and Dan Kennedy was there. I met Dan too. No, you know how they say, if you want to learn something, the best way to learn it is to teach it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I didn't set out to be a teacher.
Mm.
I remember in high school, a couple of my teachers said, David, you should be a teacher. And I looked at their jobs and their lives. I don't think so. Um,
Right.
but when I started, I remember I was in a screenwriting class in Marin County, and um, the teacher was teaching this, and being the wise ass that I am, I would say, well, that reminds me of something from the tawdry world of copywriting, and I'd say that, and these women, a couple of women who I was friends with, noticed I had a new car. I was very happy. I got excited when I talked about writing. I mean, one of them was a published novelist, one of them was a working journalist. They weren't very happy. So they asked me to teach them how to write copy. And I thought, well, okay, why not? And I knew at the time about products. So I said, well, I'll tell you what, I'll do it if you'll let me record it and sell the recording. So anything you say might go on the recording. And they said, fine. And I hired a guy from, it was a little network called New Dimensions Radio. They used to have sort of way out there, new age kind of stuff, but he was a very good professional. He came in with the mic and the headset and the, mixing board and the whole thing. And so, that course, my friend Joe Vitale,
Okay.
I shared it with him, and he knew a guy named Mark Joyner. Now, Mark
Sure.
may be well known now, but at the time, it wasn't that well known. This is about year 2000, and he said, David, Mark's starting to publish e-courses. This is pretty early. This is 20 years ago, and he said, send this to him. Send him a copy and see what. And so I sent it to Mark, and I remember he sent me an email. He said, I'm in my car. I'm halfway through the first cassette. Remember audio cassettes?
Yeah. Oh, definitely. Yeah.
And he said, and I definitely want to publish this. And so Mark was a master affiliate marketer. And like the first week, we sold $6,000 worth of courses. And I said, well, I've never seen anything like this in my life. Then, people also start to ask me to coach them. And I realized people wouldn't be asking me to do this if I don't even say I do this. And I don't particularly want to do this unless they thought I could do it, right? Unless they thought I'd be good at it.
Yeah.
So I thought, well, and then I thought, I'm a compulsive explainer. So yeah, maybe I should be doing this. And so things evolved from there. A few years, well, no, I think we'd have to fast forward about 5-6 years. I met John Carlton. We became buddies. I mean, I'd met him before, but that was at the Halbert seminar, and there were 1 million people there.
Yeah, sure.
And we ended up doing stuff together, ended up speaking together, and I was at some of his events. He came to one of my events, talk on the phone, get drunk, things like that. So, yeah, I mean, things just sort of happened. It's kind of like my life began at 40 when I really discovered direct response copywriting, and my second life. I mean, I definitely had a life before then. I don't think it was as happy or fulfilling a life. I really like it. I enjoy it. Enjoy helping people. I enjoy doing the podcast. I enjoy writing copy myself.
Yeah. I'm just curious. Do you think that you said that your parents were scientists, right? They were government workers and scientists. Do you think that scientific way of thinking, of breaking things down to their essentials and being able to communicate, do you think that maybe on some level that was maybe where this idea of teaching other people came from? Like, were you raised with a way of thinking that lent itself toward teaching, do you think?
A little bit, yeah. I think certainly the scientific way of breaking things down has informed the way I do things and the way I look at things. And one of the reasons I like copy is that, yeah, it's very emotional, even mystical, sometimes artistic, but there's also a very quantitative and replicability element, which are, sort of key hallmarks of the scientific method. So that might have been part of it. I mean, I used to hate advertising. I mean, I really hated it. And this is, but I didn't know about direct response advertising. I didn't even think of that as advertising. I thought of that as a letter I got in the mail or something. But, you know, the stupid ads, I mean, there's a rationality to direct response copywriting that is in common, I think, with scientific thinking. So long answer to your question. Yeah, good insight. I think that's true.
Yeah, well, it's also, you know, one of the things too that I've seen as an overlap, because we're talking about story, and that's where we're gonna spend a lot of our time today. But the structural aspects of direct response and screenplays or plays, you know, telling stories, but particularly screenwriting, is just highly structural. And it's just very interesting to me, like mastering story structure. That's what everybody teaches in Hollywood, right? We joked about going back to like Sid Field and people like that, but
Yeah.
story structure is one of those things that you don't feel it when you're watching a movie. Although now, you know, people tend to feel the beats of the story before they occur, right? Because we watch so much of it. But you know, these kind of structural elements are moving us outside of our awareness as we're watching a story. And the same kind of elements occur in good direct response, where we're just pulled down the page and there's a flow to it and we get caught in the story. But what's really happening under the surface is that we're being pulled by this structure all the way through to a call to action at the end. Right?
Yeah, you're absolutely right about that. And well, it's funny, for all the thinking I've done about these things, I never put that together, even though, you know, when I was studying in Hollywood, I had it beaten into my head. Story is structure. Story is structure. I even took a course from a guy. It was called Beyond Structure. But, you know, it acknowledged that structure was the baseline everybody was using. So, yeah, great point.
Cool. With that, why don't we just start getting into story? Because I know this is something we both have a passion about. So pretty early on, it sounds like, as you were getting into the direct response world, and you know, you came out of the world of journalism, so there are a lot of stories there too. You had this draw toward learning more about story. You invested in all these seminars, and you're going to LA, and you're going to screenwriting classes, playwriting, and all of this stuff. So why is story, you know, so important to what we do as marketers?
Okay. Oh, you didn't mention I was also the only marketing speaker at StoryCon, the conference for the art, science, and application of story.
Right.
That's all right.
Right.
Yeah, and so why do we respond to story? Well, I can't tell you for sure. I can tell you that there's a very believable theory out there that we are genetically predisposed to pay a different kind of attention to story than we are to statements or questions or lists or you know, power words or whatever. And I think it would be really helpful, even in answering your question, to look at some definitions of story. Now, I think the best universal definition of story comes from a book, and I was trying to find my copy, but finding a needle in the haystack easy. If you could look around here and see all the books of this book. The book is called Techniques of the Selling Writer, and it's by Dwight Swain. And selling writer doesn't mean a copywriter. It means a writer who sells his or her stories to a publisher or to a film studio.
Okay.
Or
like spec scripts and stuff like that.
Yeah. And so, Dwight Swain was not only a great teacher, he was a very successful writer himself. He'd had short stories published, he'd made films. He wasn't a big Hollywood name, but he really knew the business and the craft. And he said, let me get this exactly because I have it written down. He said that a story is a record of how somebody deals with danger.
That's really interesting.
Now, it's a real big picture way of looking at it, but I mean, think of, you know, one of the ultimate movies that it's old, but everyone knows about, The Godfather. I mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
it's really about how Vito Corleone, you know, dealt with all this stuff to his through his life and fended them off with the structure he created and the violence he perpetrated and the deals he made. You can apply this to almost anything. Now, danger doesn't need to be mortal danger. It could be psychological danger. It could be, you know, danger to your feelings. And I think well, I mean, look at Ray Donovan, if you happen to have watched that as a very recent thing. Those guys were always in danger and they were always finding a way to get out. Till the very end where there's Ray, you know, with the shovel, right. And but it's not just the thrillers and the action stuff and the cop stuff and the mob stuff. So I think that's a great definition. Now, the problem with that definition is it deals with story that we use for entertainment and story maybe that we tell instructively. I mean, maybe when your son was very young and there was something that you didn't want him to do, like run out into the street, you would tell him about someone who got hit by a car or almost got hit by a car. And you were telling him how that person dealt with danger by not stepping out into the street. Not quite as exciting as The Godfather, but probably more important to you. And so, well, here's the thing. If you get outside of everyday life and you just go into the world of business just for a second. So publishing fiction is a business, movies are a business, and copywriting is a business for business. So there are stories you sell, and there are stories that sell you. And what I mean by that is the story you sell, you know, you told me your son's working on a screenplay. Maybe he'll sell it, right? And let's hope he does. And maybe the studio will actually make it into a movie. Let's hope they do. And maybe people will see the movie. So people will pay money either through their Netflix subscription or their HBO subscription or through digital download. They're paying money for that story. That's where the selling goes. Now, a story that sells to you, that's a story someone else is going to hear and go, yeah, I like what Rocky's selling. I'd like to buy that. Yeah, right. It's a different kind of story.
Yeah.
And
because the mirror neurons kind of, right? We're seeing ourselves in that person. I mean, I guess in all stories, to whatever degree, we see ourselves as maybe the character, but I think in what you're talking about here, stories that are selling us, we have to see ourselves in that.
Yes, we do. Just as in the best story, people will identify with the hero or the villain, you know. The difference is a sales story isn't necessarily about how somebody dealt with danger. A sales story is more about how someone experienced something that solved a problem. Very boring for fiction, very exciting in your own personal life, right?
Yeah, that's a great distinction.
Thank you. So if you have a squeaky hinge on your door and you've tried 4-in-1 oil and you've tried this and that and nothing works, and finally there's this little thing with a squiggly injection thing that gets into the hinges and it works, that's really exciting to you. I can't see making a major feature film about it.
Right.
A hinge that wouldn't stop squeaking. Really? But
David Lynch might figure out a way to make that.
I mean, someone might. Yeah, someone might see it, but I can't. But I mean, anything's possible. So, these are stories. I say a story that sells a demonstration of how you solve a problem is more of a sales story. And there are a lot of ways to do it. And I know there are some exceptions. I know, for example, Chris Sadat, writes great VSLs. Pretty much does hero's journey stories in his openings. Maybe Andre Chaperon does a little bit, but most of us are going to use a different kind of story. And one of the things about the hero's journey, and I'm sure you studied it, you went to film school, I studied it in all these seminars. It's long. It starts on, an ordinary day, a day like any other, and then something happens, and then the person goes into a special world, and they have helpers, and they have antagonists, and they have tricksters, and they have mentors, and then they come to a crisis and a climax and resolution, and then they come back into the world elevated, trying to bring the gift that they got in the special world to the community in some way, shape. That's a lot to sell a little thing with a squiggly needle to make a hinge stop squeaking. And yet I've seen people in the marketing community, without really thinking this through the way we are right now, try to sell people on doing a hero's journey story in their sales letter. I mean, how long is a screenplay? 100 pages, 120 pages?
120 usually. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, geez, I've seen long sales letters. I don't think I've ever seen one that long.
Yeah, and it's funny because it's almost like this is the only story structure that they know. Like they think that the hero's journey underlies every single story that's told, and I think that's a misnomer. Like if when you come out of the world of screenwriting, it's like there's all sorts of story structures and all sorts of story forms, and those never get the play that the hero's journey form does. But that's far from the only kind of type of story, right?
Except possibly for, was it my evening with Andre or my conversation with Andre? Every story that's ever sold probably has a hero's journey, but the ones that we tell
to some extent,
the ones that we. So let's talk about a different kind of story, one that you could use in a sales letter. You could use it. You could even use it as a slogan, perhaps. You use it as a headline, and it's only 2 sentences long. The example I'm giving, if you guys can see this, is an ad that I saw for Jitterbug. It's a Jitterbug for boomers and beyond. It's a cell phone for older folks like me, even older, who aren't particularly tech savvy or tech friendly. This is kind of revolutionary, so brace yourself. They just want a phone to make calls. That's it. They really don't want to check their heart rate or have 3 lenses to take 3 all these different types of pictures. They just want a phone, and so look at the headline. I'll read it to you, but see if you can. I don't know if you can see it.
Yeah.
It says, "My friends all hate their cell phones. I love mine." That's a story. It's a story.
You got to look for it, and which we're going to do, but
you got to look for it. So my overall definition of story is much broader and probably not as compelling or useful as Dwight Swain's. He says a story is a record of how someone deals with danger. My definition of story is something happened, something changed. That's it. Now, that's not the definition of a good story necessarily, but for a sales story, that really works. My friends all hate their cell phones. Situation A in the past. I love mine. Situation B in the present. Great contrast. How many words? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 words. And they continue, their whole ad is, it's basically 10 little paragraphs like that. Cell phones have gotten, quote, "Cell phones have gotten so small, I can barely dial mine." Well, that's before the bigger cell phones, obviously. Not Jitterbug. It features a larger keypad for easy dialing. It even has an oversized display so you can actually see it. That's a story. Now, you might think, oh, it's a feature and benefit statement. Yeah, it's two people talking. It's a person complaining about cell phones of getting so small they can barely dial it, and a person answering, and there's a time passage. It's like, this happened to cell phones in the past, but Jitterbug does this. It's not like I'm looking at this cell phone does this. It's like, this is a problem I've had in the past. This is a solution. Here's another one. Quote, you'll appreciate this because your son's with you right now. I had to get my son to program it. Your Jitterbug setup process is simple. We'll even pre-program it with your favorite numbers. And they go over and over and over. Boring as hell, right? Not to a person who hates their cell phone.
Right.
And that's one of the things about these stories. When you're writing a screenplay or the Great American Novel or something for the ages, you want it to have as universal appeal as possible, right? The example about the squiggly thing for the hinge lubricant or the Jitterbug, it's going to seem either laughable at best or completely ignorable at worst, but only to the people who are not prospects. So this is narrowcasting as opposed to broadcasting.
Yeah,
that's a really important point with stories. You could show this story to you used to work with big publishers, right?
Yes.
So you could show this story to like the editor-in-chief of Random House, and she or he might say, "Oh, that's not a very good story. I mean, there's no rooting interest, there's no character development." I say, "Yeah, but it sells cell phones, right?"
Right. Yeah.
And so our purpose is different.
If I'm getting this right, it seems that what you're talking about here is almost the difference between an explicit story, right, where it's like, okay, here's the character and they're going through this. In the copy that you're describing, it's almost like an implicit story. It's like we're reading something. It doesn't necessarily present itself as a story, but there's a story underneath. There's the frustration that the person feels. There's all the things that this is costing them in their life or whatever, these annoyances or whatever. But it's when you're going to write one of these, you're kind of figuring out the story and then embedding it in the copy. Is that kind of how I'm seeing it?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to look at it. With this kind of story, it actually has the story structure, but the structure is almost masked or implicit. It doesn't come across like a story on the surface, but it gets processed like a story emotionally.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and so the thing about this is you can use this. People do use this kind of story all the time when they're talking, but they might not be using it as strategically as the copywriter for the Jitterbug ad did.
Right. Yeah.
But you can use this kind of story. Let's see if we can think of an example. I always wanted to try and sell a paperclip. I used to hate paper clips because even though they were made of stainless steel, they would rust, they would tarnish after a while. But this new coated plastic blue paper clip, man, it's beautiful and it never loses its sheen.
Yeah. It puts a smile on my face every time I pick one up.
It puts a smile on my face every time I pick one up.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the key thing about this is you don't want to overthink it. I mean, once you understand how it works, you want to make it, maybe you'll have to think a lot to do this. You want to make it sound like the way people really talk. I mean, certainly screenwriters do that in the micro, in any given scene, you want to make the language sound conversational. But here where you're telling the story, you don't want to use any grand literary language, I mean, you don't want to use something like power words, for example. You don't want to say, cell phones have become like nano many communication devices, um, so small that even an amoeba couldn't see it. Not Jitterbug. It powerfully features a larger keypad for dialing, so easy anyone could do it, even someone in a diabetic coma. You don't want to do that kind of thing, right?
Right.
You want to make it as plain and unadorned as possible, so that it slips under the radar, the fact that it is a story. And people wouldn't mind that it's a story, but you don't want to call attention to the language. You know, the stories you sell are entertaining. They call attention to themselves. This particular kind of story, the 2-sentence story, it's like an old shoe. It's just comfortable. It just seems natural. It's you hardly notice it, but it has a powerful effect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So for using a story like this, what's the thought process? So if we're, let's make a real world example out of it.
Okay.
If we're looking to start a step-by-step, go through this, use this kind of marketing story, how do we go about, we have a before and an after, but within that, I mean, those are very broad categories, but when we talk about the before, there's some subtext in there. If we actually want to tell this story, we want to tell it from, a certain person's point of view. Who is that person? What are some of the frustrations and so on that they're aware of, or something like that? And then the after, right? So there's a lot of figuring out, it would seem to me, before you actually turn it into fairly normal or more mundane words that sound like everyday conversation, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Just because it's 2 sentences doesn't mean it's easy. I mean, a great headline is maybe only 1 sentence, and it can, double or triple the revenue of a promotion.
Right. Sure.
You might spend hours coming up with those 10 or 15 words.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, it all boils down to how well you know your prospect and their lives and the conversation already going on in their mind, as Robert Collier put it so well. And the first half of this is basically going to be a complaint that you're going to be able to solve with your product. Mm-hmm. So a complaint about the way things were previous to your product. And then the second one would be a statement about how that's no longer a problem and how great things are now with your product.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So does it play into, like, let's say, the amount to which we're going to sort of document the pain and so on that people are going through? Mm-hmm. Does that play into, let's say, the level of transformation that this thing creates? Like, there's certain products, of course, where a person, let's say, has real serious pain. It's a major problem of some kind. The tendency there would seem to me to try to lay it on thicker with power words, as you're talking about, because the size of the problem, and you're going to try to tease out the emotion and all of that. Whereas something like buying a paperclip, there's not the same level of pain and so on. Like, how do you kind of make some of those decisions about the kind of language to use, when and when not to use power words, how folksy maybe to make it sound, right? So what are some of those considerations that you would think about?
Well, the best thing to do is to give your product to a few people who actually fit the profile, or go to customers and talk to them and see how they talk about it. I mean, this is where authenticity really makes a difference and matters. I mean, every one of these complaints here, cell phones have gotten so small I can barely dial mine. I'm thinking of my girlfriend's mother. That sounds a lot like her. I had to get my son to program it. I tried my sister's cell phone. I couldn't hear it. I don't need stock quotes, internet sites, or games on my phone. I just want to talk to my family and friends. You have to know what these things are that people say, and then you have to figure out either what they're going to say about the replacement, your product, the new experience, or how you would answer them in a conversation. Mm-hmm. So much of this comes to being able to fabricate conversation that sounds authentic, even if it never really happened, which is a skill you get through practice.
Mm-hmm. So what is kind of the structure here if you were looking to, let's say, we're going to write a piece of copy. How do we use the two-sentence story structurally? Is it sort of like, okay, we're going to calculate, I want to say this, and then the other, then here's the complaint, and here's the response, and here, like, how does it actually play out in a piece of copy or some other form?
Well, the great thing about this is it's flexible. You could use it a little, you could use it a lot, you could use it as a subhead, you could use it, as a series of FAQs. You could turn the befores, the quotes, or the complaints about the old way into a question. Instead of saying cell phones have gotten so small I can barely dial mine, I say I can barely dial my cell phones because it's gotten so small. What can I do about that? Well, fortunately, our keys are 4 times larger than, So it kind of sounds like objection and answer, but because you're actually demonstrating the experience of the product, it's more than just objection and answer. It's literally, taking them from one point in time to another. They used the first one as a headline. My friends all hate their cell phones. Past. I love mine. Present. That's So you could use it wherever you can find something that's going to fit what you're trying to do at that point in the copy, whether you're trying to get someone to read it with a headline, whether you're trying to evoke their curiosity in the opening, whether you're trying to get their belief in the proof. It's pretty flexible.
Yeah, that's great. So our second story type is going to be the rivals story. So this is a really interesting one.
Yeah, it is. And if you want something that's proven, the rivals story is more proven than any other format in advertising copy that's been tracked. Maybe you're familiar with, maybe most people are familiar with the Wall Street Journal
Sure.
sales letter. And for anyone who isn't, it's about a beautiful spring day, late in June, class reunion, 25 years. 2 guys went to the same college, graduated at the same time. One is the CEO of a company, and the other one's the department manager. What's the difference? And well, it never quite says. It implies that the CEO read the Wall Street Journal and the department manager
Right.
didn't. What he read Racing Forum or Mad Magazine or something like that. Yeah. So now that story was the whole letter. It depending on your promotion, if it's maybe a webinar or a video sales letter or something a lot longer, it could just be the opening. But the great thing about a rival story is it allows you to talk about 2 people and compare them one against another.
Yeah.
So it doesn't seem like it's about your product. Right. So it doesn't seem like, oh, this is an ad, I need to put up my defenses. Oh, that's interesting. What happened to this guy? What happened to this guy? And so, if I were to use this for my business, I mean, if I were to follow that format strictly, it would be something like, 10 years ago, 2 guys graduated from the same college and they both wanted to get into the world of direct response copywriting.
Right.
One of them became my client and I mentored him, and the other one didn't. Not that I turned him down or not that he decided not to. Maybe he didn't know about me. I don't know why. 10 years later, the guy who I mentored is copy chief, and the other guy is working for him and making about 1/5 as much money.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. Now, I couldn't really use that because I don't have an exact situation like that, but I have one that's really close. One guy that I mentored just got a quarterly royalty check from a newsletter publisher. for one promotion, and he'll be doing more this year. And the royalty check is more than the annual salary of someone who just applied for mentoring, or annual income because they're a freelancer. So, you know, it's rivals. It's so simple. We use this in storytelling of all types, all the time. A contrast, right? You have the big Hulk and the little skinny guy. The David and the Goliath, and the little skinny David.
Charles Atlas.
Shit out of the yeah, right. It's contrast and rivals, but that's a very powerful story, and it's better if it's true, and if it's not true, then it really had better not imply or state any specific measurable financial or health results, because that's the formula for here I come, FEC, not FEC, FTC, FDA, FBI. Yeah, one of those F words. Yeah. So
now in this kind of story mode, is it important to actually like personalize those people? Because one of the techniques I see a lot, I use it myself in my webinar, is you talk about there's two types of people, and basically the person telling the story, in this case, let's say me, I'm casting myself as somebody who over time, I've observed over a period of time that, some people were doing really, really well and others weren't. And I noticed that the common, and I really studied it, and I found that the common denominators were that these people were doing this thing differently. Right. So like in this kind of a technique, you don't necessarily say, okay, this is Joe and this is Jim, and they ended up differently. But you kind of basically say, I've looked at all of these people, and over time, I've kind of come to these conclusions that there's two different types of people, that kind of a thing. Is that, would you consider that a form like of a rival story in a way?
No, I'd consider that an abstract generalization, not very effective.
Okay.
But you could use it. You could use it.
Yeah.
If you started out, if you could use it, if you preceded it with a very specific personal example. Here was Joe. He became copy chief, and here was Jim. He's still slaving away at the lower levels of the organization.
Right.
Joe got his MBA, and Jim finished college but never got any advanced business training. And I've noticed, and then you could go to your generalized point. The problem is that stats and trends and analysis, like you're talking about, is pretty dry. It doesn't reach people where they live. Emotional stories do, but people are smart enough to know that in N of one, that is to say, one example,
an anecdote is
anecdotal evidence rather than conclusive or statistically significant.
Yeah.
So we're really talking about significance, right? The personal story is very humanly significant, but the trend you've noticed, and maybe even citing some statistics or some study, is more intellectually significant. You really need to have both.
Yeah. I mean, I remember studying Chet Holmes's core story model, and the whole idea was, at the beginning, you just stack data, fact, so that it paints the context so powerfully that you realize. But it would seem to me that's a great point after you do that, or in context of that, to dump in the rival story, because now it's like, okay, here's a graphic way and a human way to sort of illustrate the effects.
Yeah, and it might depend on the audience you're talking to. Right. I mean, I think I met Chet once. I certainly know who he was, and he seemed to like to sell to big organizations.
Yes,
and people in big organizations tend to, at least on the surface, cotton to, real statistical, factual overload. better. I mean, because that's what a manager does. That's what a CEO
Right.
does, allegedly. Who knows what they really do?
Sure.
And so yeah, I mean, if it were me, I would start out with the rival story and then say, and if you're wondering if that's just a fluke, it's not. And then boom, 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 boom,
Yeah.
boom, 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 boom.
That's
You
great.
know, hit them with all the other
Sure.
stuff. But
Cool.
I think, you know, you got to engage people's hearts. And I think the sooner you do that, and I don't know if corporate heart is like an oxymoron or something, but the corporate person has a heart underneath his corporate game face and or her corporate game face. And so if you can engage that heart first, I think you're better off.
Yeah, absolutely. So our third story, we've got three of these marketing stories that anybody can use. Our third one is what you call the second chance story.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear more about that.
So I'll give you a fairly cornball example, but then I'll tell you the template and give you some thoughts on it. Ready for the
Sure.
cornball example?
Yes.
Mary's friends had a cruel nickname for her. They called her the dam that's just about to burst. They called her this because she would sulk in silence when she was around new people. Like when she went to parties, she'd sit there looking suspiciously at people, but never saying a word. Then all of a sudden she'd start talking. She'd go on and on nonstop for minutes, sometimes even half an hour, never letting anyone else get a word in edgewise. She only had this problem with people she'd never met, and she desperately wanted to solve it because until she did, it was hard to make any new friends. And of course, her life was limited in many ways as a result. One day, she read about Talk It Up in a singles magazine. She'd tried everything else, she said, so she thought, what the hey? It turned out to be the best decision she ever made. Now Mary is a whiz at breaking the ice, and she has actually become the life of the party more times than she can count. All of because of what she learned at this breakthrough seminar. Talk It Up. Just ask her.
That riveted me. I couldn't wait to hear more.
All right. So let me give you a little thought. What you're doing here when you're putting a story like this together, remember to focus on what your product or service does for people and what it means for them, not on how your product or service works or what it's made of or what process or processes are involved or to get the results it delivers or how it's better than other products or services. The purpose of this kind of story or testimonial is to overcome your prospect's skepticism and prove your product or service works. That's all it needs to do. Don't dilute your firepower by trying to accomplish other sales goals. Stay focused on the one important job this story has to do and eliminate everything else. And that is just what it'll do for people, the change it'll make. Okay?
Yeah.
So I've got 6 steps. This one is
Sure.
the most templated one of all.
Okay.
Number 1, describe the person's life as it is now. Mary's friends had a nickname for her, the dam that's about to burst, right? Talk about how this person's life wasn't working because of a problem they had. Once she'd start talking, she'd go on for minutes, sometimes even half an hour. Give a painful example, that one. Number 3, give a painful example. Number 4, spell out how this problem led to other problems. She wanted to solve it because it was hard for her to make any new friends. 5, explain how your product led to relief from the pain caused by the main problem. She tried everything else, so she thought, what the hey, and it turned out to be the best decision she ever made. Give a powerful example. Number 6, give a powerful example of how this person's life has changed for the better. Now Mary is a whiz at breaking the ice, and she's actually become the life of the party more times than she can count. So again, without the examples, 1, describe the person's life as it is now. 2, talk about how this person's life wasn't working because of a problem they had. 3, give a painful example. 4, spell out how this problem led to other problems. 5, explain how your product led to relief from the pain caused by the main problem. And 6, give a powerful example of how this person's life is changed for the better.
Yeah. That's great. Well, how, like, when you're talking about, let's say, like, how deep, maybe it depends on the format that you're talking about,
Mhm.
but when you want to go deep into how that problem affected the person's life, I mean, obviously, like, if you go really deep into the full spectrum of everything that a problem can cost a person on all these different levels, right? Like, where is that sweet spot where you want to describe it effectively but not too much? How do you kind of, and I'm sure a lot of it's testing and a lot of it's that, but where do you make those decisions in terms of, like, all right, how heavy do I lay it on here, in terms of the extent of the problem?
Right. Well, I mean, s- I've never. It's a great question. I've never thought about that in terms of, parameters or limits. Obviously, you wouldn't want to take it down to the level of the um, the professional psychiatric diagnosis of
Great. Right.
Mary's problem,
Yeah.
or all of the mean social media stuff that was said about her after she had one of these talking jags. Um, I think, probably the answer to that would be less is more.
Hmm.
If, you can find the shortest expression of the most emotionally painful thing, which wouldn't
Yeah.
be so overly embarrassing that you probably shouldn't be publishing it,
Hmm.
right?
Right.
And in that case, that was um, she desperately wanted to solve it because until she did, it was hard to make any new friends, and of course, her life was limited in many ways as a result. I
Yeah.
mean, that's not many words, but
Sure.
and it's probably not the most egregious example, but it'll do, right? I mean, as you get to be an old boomer like me, making new friends is not as much a priority. But when you're young and single and
Yeah.
um, socially active, it's a big problem.
Sure, and I guess a lot of this too is going to come out of your, like, as you were talking about earlier, conversations with the market. How do people describe their own problem? Because essentially, what we're talking about here is the Mary in this story is really meant to be a mirror of the prospect, right? So, I mean, whether she's a construct or whether she's, a real person, she's reflecting the things that the reader is already thinking and feeling, right? So I guess that's probably where a lot of that answer is. What do they say? How do they characterize it to themselves? How do they describe the movie that's playing in their own mind, right? And then that goes into the story.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Yeah, a lot of these questions answer themselves when you know your prospect really well.
Right.
Um, know them interactively, not just sort of reading about them. Although, if you're not, and especially these days in COVID world, it's a little harder to get to meet people face to face. But a lot of things you can find in forums, um, in chat rooms and Facebook groups. And do we do they still have chat rooms? I don't know. Um, and
Yeah, sometimes.
and okay, and also in customer reviews, one even if it's not for your product, one thing you'll find, certainly on Amazon, is you know it, sometimes when you see someone really enthusiastic about something, you wonder if it's a planted review.
Hmm.
But when you
Right.
see a complaint or criticism, you never doubt its authenticity. You might not agree with it.
Yeah.
You might think, boy, that person really needs to get a life, but it, it's real. And so a lot of times you can find out what the negative self-talk is going on in people's head, or even what the negative, not self-talk, but um, conversation about this type of product when they have a criticism for it that way. So you can find out these things from research a number
Hmm.
of different ways.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's great. So we've got these three wonderful marketing stories that we can use. So for the folks that are watching this today,
Mm-hmm.
and they've got different things that they're selling, or maybe they're also trying to build authority on their social media posts or videos that they're putting out. What are some ways that you would recommend a person sort of maybe play with these or start implementing these, and implementing story maybe they've never written a story, and maybe this feels a little like intimidating in some way. What are some ways you would recommend for people to start making that leap into the world of really using story in their marketing?
Well, I can think of a couple of ways. I don't usually work with beginners, so I'm not good at this. But so if you're writing copy, now I understand a lot of the people who'll be watching this, they're not copywriters. But if you're writing copy, one of the things you'll be taught to do, or you've been taught to do most likely, is write a lot of headlines before you write one headline, or write a lot of bullets before you write a lot of bullets. So one of the things about the creative process is it does this vanishing trick. When you are just sitting still, it disappears. But when you're in motion, it actually starts to work. So one thing you could consider is just learning the structure, copying down notes from this interview, and then practice writing different ones. Just, and then if you're going to be giving a talk, or you're going to be writing an ad or a blog post, just write some things within that subject area and see what happens, rather than try and figure out exactly where you're going to plug it in. That's the first thing. The second thing is, if you can find or develop a structure, like a template, not the structure, not just an outline for what you're going to do, but structure like headline, story, transition, offer, bullet points, guarantee. That's a structure for a sales letter, for example. You might write it down and say, okay, so where could I use in this one where I'm going to be selling X, where could I use a rival story about X, or where could I use a 2-sentence story to compare it to what life was like before this, and just see where you can plug it in. One of the things that took me a long time to learn, and best writers know, and some writers never learn to their detriment, is sometimes you have to move things around a lot. You try something, it doesn't work. Does it mean you're a failure, or mean it didn't work? Answer: it means it didn't work. You're not a failure. People have to redo stuff a lot. And, it might be worth, at least for the 2-sentence ones, putting them on index cards and just shoveling them in different order. I've used index cards a lot for writing. I know screenwriters do too.
Oh, sure. Yep.
Because even though we know the name of the structure, the name of the pieces of the structure, the sequence of the structure, the funny thing about creativity is you don't really know what structure is going to work best until you start trying stuff.
Yeah.
Because a lot of this is dynamic. It's like when you're sitting still thinking, it vanishes. But when you start moving, it becomes clear to you.
It's definitely going to be more art than science.
I would say so. And, another thing is, after you put it in, read it out loud. And if you start to stumble over it when you're reading it, that's not you. That's what you've written. Then you need to change it so it just comes trippingly off the tongue.
That's fantastic. Well, David, I got to say, I know we're running short on time. This has been just super, super instructive. I think this is going to be very actionable for everybody that watches this and wants to really, I think, not only make a leap in their copy or so on, but also deeply connect with their market better, because you're talking about here, tapping into those primal emotions that we all relate to through story. And I think that's going to have a ripple effect on all of the marketing that we do, all of the copy, all of the branding that we do to communicate with our market. So this is just extremely valuable stuff. And thanks for sharing this with us today.
You're welcome.
Yeah. So let's share with us how people can find out more about you. You've got the Copywriters podcast, which comes out every week or twice a week?
Every week.
Okay. Every single week. You're a copywriter coach.
Please don't say twice a week.
Okay. No, I once a week, Copywriters podcast. But how can people find out more about you? They want to work with you. They want to be coached by you. Tell us more.
Sure. Well, I work with a handful of coaching clients at a time. It's very expensive. It's a long-term thing, and it's really meant for people who are already in the game and making money, and maybe they're stuck at a certain point, say 100,000, 150,000 a year. It's a more advanced program for people. You can find it at garfinkelcoaching.com, and then you go up to the little thing that says services, and there are a couple of coaching programs, one for business owners and one for professional copywriters. I also do one-off critiques. If you have a sales letter, you're going to be putting, significant money into the advertising, the Facebook ads or the Google ads or the native ads or whatever ads to send traffic to it. I've helped people improve their results with that. And usually it's good to have a second set of eyes, whether it's mine or someone else's who's seen a lot of these things before and knows where you're going to have a blind spot. So that's also on garfinkelcoaching.com. And I have a book, Breakthrough Copywriting. I have another book called Advertising Headlines That Make You Rich. Both of those are useful. And I'm going to be having something else coming out, and I'm just going to be as mysterious as the Egyptian Sphinx about that for now.
Is that the thing I know a little bit about?
Yeah, you know a little bit about, but
Okay.
I hope you'll keep my secret
I will
until I'm
keep
ready.
it. I'm good with secrets, so.
Thanks.
Well, thank you so much, David. This has been such a pleasure. I mean, just the opportunity to interview, somebody as accomplished as you is a real honor, and I'm so happy that we had the chance to talk today, and hopefully again in the future.
Thanks. I'd like that, and thanks for having me.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye.